Okay.
Nick, is everyone in from the waiting room at this point?
Everyone's in from the waiting room, but there'll be some stragglers.
No, that's all right. Then I'm going to get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to City Shul, to our Israel engagement program for this evening. We are so pleased to welcome you. What a great turnout we have, and so many people have been interested in this topic. Obviously, it's very relevant. And we at City Shul really believe that part of our mission is not only to do religious activities, but to do activities that connect us with each other and with Jewish values, and of course with Israel. And there's no question that's been on everyone's mind more than in the last few weeks, how the American election is going to affect us as Jews and affect us as Canadians and affect Israel. So we could think of no one better to ask than that, to answer those questions than Jon Allen. But before Penny introduces him officially, just a few words about our evening. Our evening is presented by the Israel Engagement Committee of City Shul. For those of you who are not familiar with our synagogue, we welcome you to go onto our website, www.cityshul.com. And maybe Casey can put that in the chat right now for you so you can get that. If you're not a member of our congregation, we would welcome you to come to any service or any event at all. For security reasons, we only give out links to people who have either been members or been in touch with us. So if there's another Israel engagement event that you're interested coming up, or any other kind of event that you're interested in registering for, look on our website. You can see the registration forms there, or you can be in touch with Casey. Can we mute everybody? Just hear somebody who's not muted. Thanks, Nick. A big thank you to our tech team for tonight, to Eyal Delara for tech managing this evening, and Nick Guns, our security manager. We appreciate them very much, being able to let our speakers just be speakers and not worry about waiting rooms and all sorts of other things. So the chair of our Israel engagement group is Penny Fine. She has spent many weeks organizing our Israel engagement programs for the upcoming months. We welcome you to look into them. They're all on our website. Eventually they will get there. And it is a pleasure to have her. Penny's an active member along with her husband Hugh and her family, and we're so glad that she has taken this on with a real passion and really organized for us some amazing evenings like this one. I also want to just officially welcome John and Clara as new members of City Shul. We are so delighted to have you as new members. They were just with us on Saturday for New Member Shabbat. And so, John, while you're speaking tonight as a former ambassador and a diplomat and someone with great expertise in this area, we are, or I should say, I am also especially thrilled that you're speaking to us as one of our community now, officially as part of our community. And that's a great testimonial to our to the wonder and the amazingness of City Shul. So thank you, John, for doing this. I'm going to turn the evening over to Penny. She'll let us know what the format is, and she'll do a formal introduction.
Hello, everybody. It's great to see you, and welcome. It is a thrill to have John back again, and so delighted that he's now a member of our City Shul family. That's great. As many of you know, Jon Allen has had a long, distinguished, varied career in diplomacy. Currently, he's a senior fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. During his career, he was Canadian ambassador to Israel, Canadian ambassador to Spain, and I noted a special position with the Vatican. I did not realize you were chargé d'affaires with the Vatican. I had to look up what a chargé d'affaires was, but now I know that as well. And during your various postings, you've spent a lot of time in the US, including being the Director General of North American Bureau, the Minister of Political Affairs at the Embassy in Washington, and the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Americas. So you have got a wealth of experience in dealing with the US. I noted that we gave a very broad description of what you're going to talk about, but I'm assuming that since the news seems to change every 15 seconds, whether it's the political scene, COVID, the economy, the various deals, which we no longer, I suppose, have to call the Trump deals, all of this may enter into it, but whatever it's going to be, Jon, thank you for coming. I'm looking forward, and we are going to just follow you along. And after you've spoken for roughly 20-25 minutes, we will have questions. Please put your questions into the chat box, and at the end, I will cull them and ask Jon those questions. This session will run about an hour and 45 minutes, or maybe close to an hour and 45 minutes, roughly. Okay, but Jon will be on board for about 20 of those minutes, so you have lots of time to ask your questions. Over to you, Jon.
Thank you, Penny. Thanks to City Shul. And thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to speak tonight. Thanks to Eyal and Nick, especially because without you guys, we would all be lost. The tech is so important these days. And thanks to everybody on Zoom who's come to listen. I hope we will have lots of time for questions, because generally that's the best part of the evening. I thought we could begin, and thank you, Penny. I will talk about the Biden administration and what we can expect out of that for Israel and for the Palestinians, but it will be a little more wide-ranging than that. And I'll come to Biden, Israel, and the Palestinians towards the end. But I thought we could start by talking about COVID in the region. It seems to dominate all of our thoughts these days, and it's had a significant impact in the region, not only from a health and from an economic point of view, but politically also. Last spring, Israel was considered one of the world's great success stories after a serious lockdown was imposed in the country. Bibi Netanyahu was up in the polls as Likud and the Blue and White Party jockeyed to see which party and which leader, Bibi or Benny Gantz, might be able to form a government. Ultimately, Gantz, fearing that he would lose if Bibi forced another election, and understanding that Israelis were loath to go to the polls for the fourth time in 2 years, caved into pressure, and he joined a coalition with Bibi Netanyahu. He argued at the time, and I know my sister and Dov Marmer and others agreed. He argued that he had no choice, given the challenges that Israel faced from COVID and from a faltering economy. In the process, his party, Blue and White, whose main election plank had been, let's get rid of Bibi, split in two. I won't go into the details here, but the coalition agreement provided that Bibi would serve as prime minister for the first 18 months and then would hand over the reins to Gantz. Fast forward to September, when COVID was spreading so fast that Israel then had the highest number of cases per capita in the world and became the first country to reimpose a complete lockdown. Why? Because the country had opened up far too fast, because Orthodox Jews, the Haredim, and to a slightly lesser extent, Palestinian Israelis ignored social distancing requirements, and because it's an Israeli characteristic to ignore rules and authority, except of course in times of war. If you've ever stood in line waiting for a bus in Israel, or tried to get off an elevator while people were pushing to get in, you know what I mean about the Israeli characteristic. Turning to the West Bank and Gaza, at first, COVID seemed to bypass the territories completely. But as in Israel, large weddings, funerals, and other social gatherings began to take their toll. The case numbers skyrocketed over the summer and fall. There are currently over 9,000 active cases in the territories. 670 people have died, and 79 of Gaza's approximately 100 ventilators are now in use. Needless to say, there are concerns that the medical system will be overwhelmed if the caseload continues apace. And of course, Saab Erekat, the Palestinian Authority's chief negotiator and a confidant of both Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, died of COVID while being treated at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. As I mentioned, though, COVID has had significant political effects in Israel as well. Across the country, tens of thousands of Israelis take to the streets every Saturday to protest the Prime Minister's mismanagement of the pandemic and of the economy. His polling numbers have dropped significantly, and Naftali Bennett, the leader of the right-wing Yamina party, has seen his popularity soar. The possible combinations of coalitions that might be formed should Israel go to the polls are numerous, and the outcomes are impossible to predict. But suffice it to say, if there is an election, Bibi Netanyahu is no longer assured of victory. Will Bennett's popularity last? Would he be able to cobble together a right-of-center coalition without Likud and oust Netanyahu? Would he form a coalition with Likud, but demand to be the prime minister? Or would he decide instead to form a coalition with Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party and what's left of blue and white? Another question that I heard raised today is the Arab Party. They had 15 seats in the last election. Would the center left finally agree to join with the Arabs in a coalition? All these are up in the air. Whatever the outcome, though, progressives, and I know there's a few progressives at City Shul, should be careful what they wish for. As much as many, both on the left and the right, would like to see the end of the almost 12 years of Bibi Netanyahu as prime minister, Naftali Bennett, should he take over, would likely be more right-wing, more pro-settlement, and more anti-Palestinian than Netanyahu. His partner in crime, Ayelet Shaked, is a former Likud Minister of Justice who has led efforts to politicize the courts and denounce the civil service. She regularly characterizes NGOs and the press as traitors, and during the last election, she put out a political ad mocking her critics. It was a bottle of perfume called fascism. As for the current Likud blue and white coalition, let's be clear. It's a coalition in name only. For example, Bibi Netanyahu proposed to annex 30% of the West Bank, and he entered into peace deals with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain without even consulting his blue and white partners. Now, those partners aren't just any old partners. Benny Gantz is the Minister of Defense, and Gabi Ashkenazi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Both of them happen to be former chiefs of defense staff. The UAE deal, which we'll talk about more in a minute, includes a side agreement for the United States to sell to the UAE F-35 aircraft. Now, those aircraft are the most sophisticated planes in the world. This unprecedented and potentially game-changing event for the region also was never raised with Gantz, or frankly, with the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. Indeed, the best that can be said for the current coalition is that Gantz may have slowed the annexation process, protected the independence of the judiciary and the office of the Attorney General, and kept the prosecution of the Prime Minister on track. Bibi's trial on 3 cases of bribery and fraud was slated to begin at the end of January and has now been delayed into February. Now, let's turn briefly to the Abraham Accords, the so-called peace deals recently entered into with the UAE, Bahrain, and subsequently Sudan. I say so-called peace deals only because, unlike the peace agreements that were signed with Egypt and with Jordan, Israel was never at war with any of these countries, but they're important and they're hugely big deals as far as Israel and the Gulf states are concerned. Any analysis of these agreements is truly a case of where you sit depends heavily on where you stand. There are clear winners and losers. The winners include Bibi Netanyahu, who gained both legitimacy for Israel throughout much of the Arab world and important allies in the fight against Iran. In return, he gave up very little, except perhaps his much opposed plans to annex the West Bank. I say perhaps because it's not clear that Bibi was serious about a full annexation, and because he himself has argued that annexation is merely suspended rather than permanently foreclosed. We should recall here that until these accords were signed, the position of the Arab world had been clear. There would be no recognition of Israel unless and until Israel was ready to make peace with the Palestinians. The Abraham Accords were also a short-term boost for Donald Trump. He was able to score a win with evangelicals and with right-wing Jews in the US just before the election, and he was also able to shift the focus from his failed deal of the century. Foreign policy, however, rarely plays a big role in US elections, and in the end, these agreements had little impact outside of Israel and the Washington Beltway. The other winners were the three signatories. Sudan traded recognition of Israel for Trump agreeing to remove the country from the US terrorism list. The UAE and Bahrain gained access to strategic Israeli defense equipment and intelligence in the areas of cyber, AI, surveillance, and food security. And if the new US Congress and the Biden administration agree, the UAE, as I mentioned, will also acquire F-35s and other sophisticated military equipment from the US. To date, the only two countries that have those planes are Israel and the United States. The Gulf states also gain an important ally in their conflict with Iran. And finally, they can claim success in preventing the annexation of the West Bank from proceeding, something the incoming Biden administration appreciates having off the agenda. Going forward, the deals with the Gulf states raise a number of questions vis-a-vis the Palestinians, who along with Iran and Turkey were the clear losers here. Are the Gulf states serious in their stated willingness to support the Palestinians? What are their bottom lines? Will they withdraw their recognition if Israel once again threatens annexation? What about settlement expansion beyond the existing settlement blocks? What about a fourth war in Gaza? What happens if the Biden administration and/or Congress veto the sale of the F-35s? These are all questions that we will watch over the next few months and few years. They're clearly key for the Palestinians and for Israel. In addition to the Palestinians who described the accords as a stab in the back, Iran was also a big loser. It became even more isolated in the region at a time when it is suffering under punishing US sanctions, an economy in free fall, and the worst outbreak of COVID in the entire Middle East. So let's turn finally to the possible changes that a Biden administration might signal for the region. If you are someone who is looking for a bit more balance in the treatment of Israel and the Palestinians, it won't be hard for Biden to meet your expectations. To find some clues about what Biden policies going forward are going to be, let's quickly review Donald Trump's recent gifts to Israel. He moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem and recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights and the so-called settlement blocks, all in contravention of previous US policy and the consensus within the international community. He withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and imposed, as I said, the strictest US sanctions ever on that country. He cut off all US funding, both to UNRWA, the UN agency that funds medical care, social services, and education for Palestinian refugees, and to the Palestinian Authority more generally. He closed the US consulate in East Jerusalem, which dealt with Palestinian affairs, and he closed the Palestinian Authority's office in Washington. Finally, he laid out his so-called deal of the century. The proposal, which ultimately went nowhere, rather blatantly sided with Israel against the Palestinians on every one of the final key status issues that were supposedly to be agreed to between the parties. Now, it's worth remembering at this point that Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is an ardent evangelical Christian for whom Israeli sovereignty from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River and the rapture are both articles of faith. Trump's ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, is a longtime supporter and funder of illegal settlements. I think it's safe to say that Israel is unlikely to see a more pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian American duo ever again. So what will Joe Biden do after January 21? He will reopen the PA office in Washington and the consulate in East Jerusalem. He will restate the US's strong support for a negotiated two-state solution to the conflict. He will reinstate funding to the Palestinian Authority and to UNRWA. He will support the recent Abraham Accords. He will oppose any efforts to revive talks of annexation, but he will not return the US Embassy to Tel Aviv, and he will probably not reverse the US recognition of the annexation of Gaza, of the Golan. He will make clear US opposition to settlement expansion, in particular outside the settlement blocks. But on this issue, which is in many ways crucial to the future of a two-state solution and to Israel's future as a Jewish state and a democracy, there can only be results if Biden backs up his criticism with actions. And when I say actions, I mean serious political pressure combined with threats to cut off aid and/or trade. The US, the EU, and Canada for that matter, have been critical of the settlements for years, and successive Israeli administrations, both Likud and others, have simply ignored the criticism, violated international law, and continued to eat into the territory of a future Palestinian state. 600,000 settlers now live in what was intended to be that Palestinian state. More broadly, Biden will explore the possibilities of restarting the Iran nuclear deal if he can convince the P5, Germany, and Iran to return to the table. For their part, and as a sign of their pleasure at seeing Trump defeated, the Palestinians made a number of positive moves this past week in an effort to build bridges with the incoming Biden administration. On Tuesday, the PA announced that it was renewing security coordination with Israel in the West Bank and was considering cutting stipends to the families of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, an issue that has been on Israel's agenda for some time. PA officials also have said that they will send envoys back to Bahrain and the UAE after recalling them 3 months ago for normalizing relations with Israel. Haaretz reported today that senior Palestinians have already been in touch with Biden foreign policy officials to discuss issues including settlements and the labeling of Israeli products. Will Joe Biden bring peace to the Middle East overnight or even in his first term? Unlikely. Will he try to create the conditions over time that will help bring the two sides together? Hopefully. I used to say that nothing positive will happen vis-a-vis this conflict until Donald Trump, Bibi Netanyahu, and Mahmoud Abbas all pass from the scene. Well, 1 down and 2 to go. Thank you very much, and I'm really happy to take your questions. Ayel and
Sorry about that.
Penny.
I'm sorry, we don't have any questions yet in the chat box. Please, if you'd like, now I guess you can raise your, how about if you raise your hand?
Looked up in the chat box. Before that, it was closed. People can now enter.
Oh, it was closed. I'm sorry. You can now put in questions. In the meanwhile, I'll start us off, John, just so that we understand the Abraham Accords. What kind of recognition to Israel as a state was accrued from that arrangement?
So Bahrain and the UAE recognized Israel as a state. They will be exchanging ambassadors. There have already been significant visits by Israeli business to the UAE and vice versa. I understand there's already tourism for people wanting to escape the lockdown in Israel. They've been visiting the UAE. It's quite a paradise in some ways. So that's the beginning, but as I suggested, there's much more in store, and that involves the Gulf states, these two and perhaps more, really having access to some of the most sophisticated technology that Israel has and is willing to share. One of the interesting parts that I hadn't realized was there was a number of people in the food sector that visited the UAE because, of course, they import almost all of their food, and they're looking to Israel as a country that has been able to produce much of its own food as a model for what they may become using Israeli greenhouse and other food technologies. But I think the limits are small. There's multiple things that can happen. And so for Israel and for the Gulf states, it's a very positive set of deals. I think the fact that they were called the Abraham Accords is quite telling. It was one of the best communication lines that the Trump and Jared Kushner administration have done. Of course, Abraham being the father of all three religions involved in these deals.
Okay, we have a couple of questions based on the role of Saudi Arabia. What do you make of the recent news that Bibi met with the Saudis, and what do you anticipate for the role of the Saudis in the region? He denies it ever happened, but we'd love to hear your words on it.
Right. The Saudis deny it happened. Bibi's not denying it. And as we said before we started, there was some tracking of an Israeli plane to Saudi Arabia over the weekend when Bibi was alleged to have gone. What do I make of it? First, I think we should step back. When I said that the original arrangement between the Arabs and Israel was that there would be no recognition of Israel unless and until Israel made a deal with the Palestinians. That was a deal that was put on the table by the Saudis. It was called the Arab Peace Initiative, but it came out of the King of Saud. And the view is that when the UAE and Bahrain made the deal with Israel, they had the permission of Saudi Arabia. It was thought at the time that the king was reluctant to move forward, but that his son, MBS, was much more interested. And so what we're seeing now is a bit of a game, and we're waiting to see whether the king or MBS are going to win out and whether there will be recognition. But in addition, and setting aside recognition by the Saudis, what is also going on is an effort for Israel to consult with the Saudis and with the UAE ahead of the Biden inauguration. They want to come together in their views on how they are going to approach the Biden administration on the issue of Iran. The Gulf and Israel, of course, were happy when Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, the Iran deal, and they are now concerned that he will follow through on what he has said he is going to do and try and renegotiate a deal. He's going to try and make it a better deal. It won't only include nuclear, but it'll hopefully include ballistic missiles, and hopefully it will dampen down terrorism by the Iranians. Good luck. But essentially they're worried, and they want to develop a game plan and go see Biden and Tony Blinken in the State Department and present a coordinated front. So I think that was probably as much of the conversation as the issue of recognition, which at this point is important for Israel, but it's not key.
This is a very important question. In light of the settlement growth on the West Bank and the resulting decrease in territory effectively controlled by the PA, is a two-state solution still viable? And could it constrain other potential resolutions? And following up on that, what might an alternative solution look like?
Well, I still believe in the two-state solution. I may be in the minority. There are people much more intelligent than me that have been involved in the region longer that are beginning to be more and more pessimistic. Clearly, if settlement expansion continues, it will become more and more difficult. For the two-state solution to happen, there is going to have to be a decision to remove the economic settlers from settlements that they are now in, and there's going to have to be a lot of money spent to move them into Israel proper. When you ask what are the options, well, there are two bad options as far as I'm concerned. One is bad options, in terms, if you're somebody that supports Israel, and if you're somebody that supports Israel as a democracy, then there are two bad options. One option is that Israel will not agree to any deal with the Palestinians, and therefore, as the Palestinian population grows, they will eventually become a majority in the area from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. And when that happens, Israel is going to have to decide whether it wants to remain a democracy and have all of the people in that territory vote, in which case a majority Arab population will become the majority, or they want to have an apartheid state. And the word apartheid was not used very frequently before, but it is being used increasingly now to describe what may happen in Israel. If Israel decides to continue to treat the Palestinians in the West Bank and Jordan Valley and in Gaza as third-class citizens, then there will be effectively an apartheid state. You will have a state where one set of people have one set of rights and obligations, and an entire other set have lesser rights and perhaps the same obligations. I don't know. So the very strange thing about what's going on in Israel now, and frankly, what's going on in Europe and Canada and the United States, is that everybody sees this happening. And Israelis, well, Israelis for the most part ignore it, but Israeli politicians can't ignore it. And yet they refuse, at least the ones on the right, refuse to want to deal with it. The Tzipi Livnis of the world, the Ehud Baraks of the world, all people who are no longer in power, the former heads of Mossad, the many former heads of Mossad, and of the internal security services, and of the IDF, have all spoken up explaining this reality. And yet Bibi and Bennett and others continue to expand the settlements without a long-term game plan. And so we'll see what happens. Hopefully there will be a turnaround. Hopefully people will come to their senses, and hopefully they'll find a way to negotiate with the Palestinians. Now, I should say this requires the Palestinians getting their act together. They've got a sclerotic leadership. They're divided between Hamas and Fatah. This is not going to happen overnight. They need a new generation of people that are, I mean, the Palestinians are committed to peace, but they need a generation that gets its act together to be able to articulate the kinds of peace that they want. And that's not easy, but that's what has to happen. And that's why Mahmoud Abbas has to pass from the scene along with Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump.
We've had several questions about a replacement for Abbas. Is there anyone on the scene that you know of? And how do you think the person or persons that might replace him, what kind of impact they might have on the peace process?
To be honest, I'm really not up to speed on the internecine politics of the PA, and Palestinians that I speak to, part of the younger generation, I think are not also aware of what's happening. Ironically, one of the pretenders to the throne, a fellow named Dahlan, who actually was the head of security before Hamas and Fatah split, now lives in the UAE, is a political advisor of sorts to the government and the emir there. And he undoubtedly would love to come back and head a Palestinian authority. Most in the territory say that will never happen. They will never allow it, but you never know. But clearly they do need new, younger, non-corrupt leadership, and that's a challenge.
Okay, the question was asked of whether in fact the reinstatement of the Iran deal is a good thing. We know it's very unpopular, has been very unpopular in Israel. And an interesting other question related to that is, should the deal be revived? Might it include Iran withdrawing some of its influence in Lebanon, in Beirut?
I think the Iran deal was a good thing. Interestingly, the IDF also thought it was a good thing before Trump pulled out of it, and Bibi urged the Americans either not to sign it and then pull out of it. I think the situation on the ground demonstrates why. The deal wasn't perfect, but it had slowed and stopped certain aspects of Iran's efforts to build nuclear weapons, to move through the various stages required to do that. That had been halted. And now that the Trump administration has pulled out of the deal, the Iranians have moved ahead. And they moved ahead in a dangerous way. It's not that they'll be able to make a bomb and make it usable within weeks or months, but they have moved along the pathway, and that's not good for the region. It's not good for the region, not only because Iran could then pose a threat, a nuclear threat, because if Iran gets a nuclear bomb, then Saudi Arabia will demand also to have one. And once you get Israel and Saudi and Iran in that volatile region with nuclear weapons, you've got a situation that is too dangerous to imagine. Very different than the US and Russia having nuclear weapons and having mutual assured destruction, deterring both of them. In that region, nuclear weapons is not a good idea. On the question of Iran and Lebanon, I don't think they get into that kind of detail. And I don't think it's really possible to construct an agreement that is that fine in detail. But I do think that the Americans will try in order to sell it to Congress and to sell it to the Israelis and the Gulf states. They will try to expand the previous deal. Now, unfortunately, having pulled out of the last one, they don't have a lot of credibility. That's what happens when you enter into a deal and all sides are complying with it. And then one of the parties says, sorry, we're out of here. So it's going to take time, I think, for the Biden administration to reestablish credibility. And to be honest, I haven't got a clue whether at this point the Iranians are interested. I would think they would be interested because they want to get rid of those sanctions. They want to be able to import medicines to deal with COVID. They want to get their economy back going. So they've got reasons to want to move forward, but how they do so, we have to wait and see. Bibi will oppose it from day one, as he did when he visited Washington without an invitation from Obama, went straight to Congress, spoke to Congress. One of the most outrageous breaches of protocol that I had ever witnessed. But he made his case to Congress. He defended Israel's interests, and then he got Trump to deliver the goods.
This is just another question which deals with the volatility, what might happen in terms of the volatility in the area. F-35s, explain why a small nation is being granted these fighter jets, which only are at this point in Israel and the United States. What's the relevance and the meaning of all of that for the region?
Well, it's the same reason that another small nation called Israel wanted them and got them. It's because if you've got a sophisticated plane like that, it would be, and they're not only, by the way, they're not only getting the F-35s, they're also getting equipment that will be able to defend against incoming ballistic missiles and incoming planes. That's part of the deal. And there are those in Israel, in the IDF and in other agencies that are concerned about this, because Israel has always had what's called a qualitative edge, a qualitative military edge, QME. And the suggestion is that by giving one Gulf state these planes, Israel will lose that edge. Now, we should remember that when Israel entered into agreements with the Egyptians the Americans, to sweeten the deal, gave them lots of military aid. And when the Israelis entered into a deal with the Jordanians, the Americans gave them aid, both military and other. So there's always sweeteners in the package here. But the F-35s are frankly another level of sophistication. And that's why, it's not clear what Congress is going to want to do, because it may be in Bibi's interests to do it, but it may not be in the United States' interests to deliver these kinds of planes to a country that may or may not be an ally, depending on what goes on. I mean, why does UAE want them? They want them because they see Iran as their biggest enemy, and they wanted to be able to defend against Iran. And from their point of view, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Question about the settlements. A scenario of removing 600,000 settlers from that area. We remember what happened in the Sinai. How do you think this could play out in terms of the 600,000?
They'll never remove 600,000 people. And I don't think anybody believes that's possible. But there are settlers living in what are called the settlement blocks that, because of facts on the ground, most, including the Palestinians, agree that they will remain. Of the 600,000, how many are there? 350, 400,000 people in the settlement blocks, 300, I'm not sure. I don't know what the exact numbers are. What we're talking about is removing a sufficient number of settlers so that there is a contiguous Palestinian state. If expansion continues, you're going to have a set of Bantustans unconnected. You're going to have to pass through settlements in order to get from the southern part of Palestine to the northern part of Palestine. There's going to be no coherence. It's not clear that East Jerusalem would be around to be the capital of the Palestinian state, because the Israelis are expanding even now into East Jerusalem and around East Jerusalem, cutting it and Bethlehem off from other parts of the Palestinian state. So no, we're not going to remove 600,000. And hopefully this time Israel and perhaps the international community will throw in enough money. They didn't do it properly when the settlers left Gaza, and a lot of those settlers are unhappy to this day. But if you throw enough money at people, just the way that you're going to have to throw money at the Palestinians to compensate them for not coming back, because we know that millions of Palestinian refugees are also not coming back if there's a deal. So put a lot of money on the table and convince people who essentially moved to the settlements because it was cheaper, much cheaper, because there was available land, because they were going to live very, very comfortably, be protected, have low taxes. Those are the people that you're going to have to move. They're not religious fanatics. They're not in the blocks. And hopefully that will be enough to create a real state, a Palestinian state.
Thank you. Another question about the Palestinian society. The question was, what's your sense of the capacity and as well as the willingness of Palestinian civil society to assist themselves and to develop relations with Israeli civil society?
Oh, I think there's a significant capacity, civil society to civil society. You know, Penny, that I'm on the board of a wonderful NGO called Project Rosanna that works to build bridges between Palestinians and Israelis through the health sector. And we are working with Palestinian hospitals, Palestinian rehab centers, Palestinian doctors, and bringing them together with Israelis, Palestinian psychiatrists and psychologists, bringing them together with Palestinian, Israeli, and Jewish psychologists, training them. There's absolutely no problem getting the two societies together. And there's lots of cynicism within the Palestinian society about their government and about the process. But the problem is not civil society. The problem is getting the politicians together. And just on the question of, do Palestinians still believe in the two-state solution? I truly believe they do. The polls have indicated that there is still close to a majority of Palestinians who believe in a two-state solution. There's no question that there are many that are now saying, forget it, it's not going to happen, and let's just go to the one state. But when they say a one state, they don't mean a one state in which they're second or third class citizens. They mean a one state when eventually they're going to be the majority. So I think Palestinians still believe in it, but they have to see a partner on the other side that is willing to contemplate. Bibi Netanyahu for 12 years has basically refused to negotiate in a bona fides matter. He said in the last two elections that there will never be a Palestinian state when he is prime minister. And he has done more to expand the settlements than anyone else in the worst of places, in the deepest parts of the West Bank and around East Jerusalem. So as long as there's a leader on that side that is unwilling to even contemplate a two-state solution, what's the hope for the Palestinian civil society and middle class? Not much.
And this is an interesting question. Just as there are Arab Palestinian towns in Israel, if there's a genuine peace in the future, why could there not be Jewish towns in a future Palestinian state?
Well, there could be. And there are a number of especially religious settlers who have said they're not going anywhere and they don't mind living in a Palestinian state because they were never terribly interested in Israel as a state anyway. So they are interested in being on what they consider to have been biblical lands given to them, the Jews, 3,000 years ago, and they would be fine, allegedly, to stay where they were, presumably as long as they were left in peace. But I frankly don't see a lot of Israelis, especially those economic settlers, or even most of the people in the settlement blocks wanting to live under Palestinian rule. As you know, there are still rumors, part of the Trump plan, part of certain right-wing politicians' plans are to take that area that you just talked about where Palestinian Israelis live, the so-called triangle, and when a Palestinian state is created, transfer that whole area into Palestine. Sort of in the worst case scenario, it's kind of a case of ethnic cleansing. You can call it what you want, but the idea is that's Palestine. Let all of the Palestinian Israelis go there, and we will have our ethnically national Jewish state.
And one last question, although please feel free, we have a little bit of time if you want to ask a couple more questions. They've been terrific. Is the blue and white still relevant in Israeli politics, and under what circumstances?
Well, I think they're still relevant because in Israeli politics, it's all about coalition. And even if you're a party with 5 seats or 10 seats, you're relevant because you can make the difference in getting that coalition. There is actually talk, when blue and white split, Yair Lapid formed Yesh Atid, and blue and white remain. So you have the two original, the leaders of blue and white split. There is talk about blue and white joining Yair Lapid again, with Lapid as the leader, not Benny Gantz or Ashkenazi. So if they actually put the pieces back together again, they could have a significant bloc. And if they could coerce others, it's not clear how many others. It's not clear whether the Labour Party would survive. It's not clear how many seats Meretz would get. And it's not clear whether they would finally recognize the Arab parties as a part of Israel and join with them in a coalition. None of that is clear, but yes, blue and white exists. It might join with Lapid and form yet another party or whatever. And so they're not out of the game by any stretch of the imagination. It seems to be that Benny Gantz no longer wants to be prime minister. He has hinted at this. He's almost said it. And he's ready to hand over the reins to somebody else.
Given the realities of the political scene in the United States right now, how much wiggle room does Biden really have, given that the country appears to be split? He's got extremes. If he doesn't win if he doesn't win the Senate, he's in serious trouble. He has progressives on the one hand who will be pushing him in one direction. He has a lot of the United States still think in an isolationist way in terms of foreign policy. How just as a betting man, how good are his chances?
Well, I haven't read it all, but I've read excerpts. If you look at Barack Obama's memoirs, when he took over, he not only had the Senate and the House, but he had over 60 seats in the Senate, which means he could beat the filibuster, and he couldn't get much done. So we're talking now about a guy, you described the situation very well. If the Democrats can win those 2 seats in Georgia and can make a 50-50 split in the Senate, that will be helpful. Now, all that said, he's got a million things that he's got to do domestically, the economy, COVID, bring the country together. He's got a million things he's got to do from a foreign policy perspective, China, Russia, Iran. I mean, we've got conflicts in Africa. So Israel, frankly, and the Palestinians are not likely going to be super high on his agenda. But let me just say that foreign policy, as long as you're not trying to enter into a formal treaty, which does require Senate approval, you can do a lot in foreign policy without the Senate or the House. You can get a lot of flack from the Senate and the House, and they can make your life miserable in other ways. But if you recall, the Iran deal was entered into without the approval of Congress. He didn't need Congress to do that. And rejoining the WHO, he doesn't need Congress. And rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, he doesn't need Congress. So and frankly, reaching out to the liberal world order and trying to bring liberal democracies together does not require Congress. So the American administration, the Biden administration, with the impressive team that he's put together, can do a lot to begin to heal. But he's got a lot of stuff on his plate, and I don't envy the guy. He's 78 years old, and he's just taken on the biggest job in the world.
Jon, thank you so much. The presentation was wonderful and the questions were terrific. Thank all of you. We've got a big group and you've been fantastic. For the privilege of your experience as a diplomat, as a scholar, for the wisdom you bring, the moderate and yet hopeful voice that you project, thank you. It's a terribly difficult time we're all going through. And frankly, we just need more Jon Allens in the world to ground us, to give us real information, hope, but realistic hope. So thank you so much to everybody who came, and particularly to Jon. And we're so glad that you're now a City Shul member. This is fantastic. I won't pitch too many Israel events. In fact, I'll just pitch one at this point. The next Israel engagement event will be a really excellent documentary, which was at the Toronto Jewish Film Festival. It's on a legendary basketball player who I've never heard of, but all Israelis know, Alcy Perry. Jon, you may have known, he was an African-American who was recruited to play for the Maccabi team. And for the first time, Israel won 2 championships. And it's a terrific story because this is a man of depth. The story's great. And it's the 19th of December. We start with Havdalah, which the rabbi will conduct, and then we will watch the film individually and come back to discuss it. So, and there are many, many more things happening this year. So as you mentioned, Zoom opens up all kinds of opportunities. I see people here that are not members of City Shul, I guess I should say yet, but it's great to have you all here. And thank you, Rabbi. And hopefully next time we'll gather this way, it will be the 19th. But most of all, Jon, I think I'll sleep better tonight. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Penny, for all of your wonderful efforts in getting these great programs organized. Everyone have a good night. Be hopeful, be optimistic. There's light at the end of the tunnel and we are approaching January 20th. Thank you
Yes.
so much. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Oh, I didn't get to these yet. That's too bad.
What's that?